So, hello, good evening, and welcome to Paradigm Shift TV. This evening in the studio we have,
Jon Witterick from getoutofdebtfree.org.
and my good self, Dr. Stephen Hopwood from Paradigm Shift TV. And this evening we are intending to present to you, the general public, a special presentation entitled The Big Issue, because we do believe that there is a big issue that does need to be understood in order that we can start to all move forward and deal with this global financial problem that is affecting absolutely everybody. So tonight we have Jon and myself, and we will just take a little bit of time to focus on the big issue. Jon, what is the big issue?
Right, Steve, I think the big issue is really who issues the currency. Because people don't really wonder, people wonder where's the money come from. And I think once you actually realise what the main issue is, then everything else falls into place.
Okay,
the solutions and everything else.
Excellent. So we used to have hundreds of pounds, and then it was thousands, and then millions, and now billions and trillions, and now quadrillions even. So there's obviously money has been issued into the circulation. There's more money around than there ever used to be, and that has had to have come from somewhere and been issued by somebody. Now, who is it that does that?
Well, what we do know is it's not the government. Because if the government was issuing money, they'd be able to issue it without charging any interest. So we've got to think, where does the government get its money from?
Okay, well, where do we all get our money from? Where has all this money come from? And we have either, it's one or the other. It's either created by the government without debt and without interest, or it's created privately by private banks as a debt and at interest. And really, there's only those two possibilities of where money has come from.
Certainly.
And when we take a closer look at the situation, what do we find, Jon?
Well, we find at the moment record levels of personal debt. We find companies going into bankruptcy at an alarming rate, and we're seeing gradually all the major, a lot of the major nations in Europe actually defaulting on their debt. So we're going to wonder, where did all this debt come from? Why is there so much debt? And in a time where we've got wonderful efficiency in manufacturing, we have computers. We have cheap labour from abroad, and yet our economy is in such a mess. Why is it? What is the actual reason?
So the answer is,
well,
who issues the currency?
Who issues the currency?
Well, again, so let's have a close look at it. And the facts are that currently, with our global financial system, we have a system of private central banks. The Federal Reserve is clearly a privately owned bank.
Yeah.
The Bank of England is independent, sets its own agenda,
Yeah.
and issues currency out of thin air, adds a debt and that interest. So we have these private central banking institutions around the world that are allowed to issue money out of thin air and then charge interest on that. And what they do, from my understanding, is that then that money goes into circulation and is then further fractionalized by the private commercial banks. So normally the fractional reserve ratio is 9-to-1. So the commercial banks issue 9-to-1 ratio to the money that they actually have, that they take from the central banks. And so it's a Ponzi scheme of exponential extrapolation and fractionalization of currency into the market that will only ever result in an exponential debt curve, escalating inflation, and a consolidation of the power and wealth in the hands of the few that issue the currency. And it appears there's a very small cabal of private central banking families that run the whole system.
And just to get that clear, fractional reserve banking is where the bank will have, say, if the bank's got £10,000, it's suddenly able to create perhaps 70, 80, 90,000 pounds from that and charge interest. That's fractional reserve banking, yeah?
It is.
Yeah.
I saw this on the BBC the other day. We're talking about bankers' bonuses, and if they pay the bankers in dividends and shares rather than in actual cash, then they would say that cash would remain in the system. And then they said this amazing thing: if £1 billion were to remain in the system, not be taken out in bonuses, that money could then enable the banks to lend £10 billion. They actually said that on the BBC, and that is the way in which it works. The banks take £1 billion and they can lend 10 billion. And the mathematics of that need to be understood, really, because what we're all experiencing now is a direct, inevitable, mathematical consequence of allowing private central banks and private commercial banks to issue and fractionalise our currency and lend money to us that they've just conjured out of thin air as a debt. And that the mathematics will mean that the interest payments that they take back for this fiat currency hoovers all of the real money out of our global circulation and system until there is nothing, as you were saying.
That's
but,
right.
But
That's
more
right.
and more debt.
And we have to wonder why there's record levels of debt. Well, when they're, creating this money and then charging the interest, the money supply has to grow exponentially just to stop everything crashing straight away. If they hadn't added the quantitative easing and bailed out the banks, then we'd already be in a sort of post fractional reserve banking episode already, because it would have already crashed had huge amounts of money. And I'm talking, if you realise how much money has been used by the British taxpayers' money, 1.3 trillion to bail out the major banks in the UK. That's more than our current national debt. So it's a huge amount of money. That would have been enough to pay off pretty well the nation's mortgages, I'm guessing.
And we borrowed it from the banks who created it out of thin air.
Right,
We're going as in debt to the banks, we're paying interest to the banks, and then the austerity measures, the cut in public services. So what we had is a government that's actually funding corporate welfare.
Certainly.
Private
Certainly.
corporate welfare to the tune of trillions at the expense of public welfare. And it's the public that are paying for this massive transference of wealth in favour of the power leaders.
Well, Steve, it's the 99% that are paying for the 1%. I mean, it's actually the 99.9 paying for the 0.1%. So we wonder why, we're having these austerity measures and cuts. That's purely so that there's enough money left over to pay the interest on the current deficit. It is absolutely crazy. It is absolutely criminal, and we've got to draw attention to what the big issue is. And that's why we're really trying to make it really clear, really simple, what the problem is. And then once we realise that, then of course the solutions come really clearly.
And solution is inherent in the understanding of the problem. Currently we have private banks issuing currency out of thin air as a debt and that interest, which is the 0.01%, and we need the 99.9%, the people, the country, the nation, the government, to issue currency into circulation without debt and without interest, to bring our global currency up into the value of the assets of our nation, and then we can have a stable economy.
Certainly, Steve. And of course, it wouldn't be the government creating that money without interest, because we would have a government truly of the people, not a government of the banks, but a government of the people, the government of the 99%. And that government would be creating money. And we're not being fanciful here, because this has happened throughout American history. There have been governments which have created their own money debt-free and interest-free, because that is the government's prerogative. The government does actually create some money. It creates 3%, roughly, of the pound coins and the paper notes. Everything else suddenly goes to the private banks.
It's digital.
And it's created on a computer keyboard. Very simple.
Well, I think the most pertinent example in our recent history is JFK. Always stands out to me, really. I mean, he stood up to Vietnam and the corporations, but he said no to the Federal Reserve, and he issued his own silver certificate, government-backed, debt-free, interest-free currency. $4 billion was coming off the printing presses into circulation. It would have cleared the national debt, balanced the budget deficit, and funded public infrastructure, and brought America back onto its feet as it should have been. And coincidentally, he was taken out by, a lone nut, basically. But even though the presidential decree had been signed and all of that had actually been put into legislative form,
it was reversed
after his death somehow, and it was not quite clear how. All of that policy was completely eradicated, and the country returned to borrowing from the private Federal Reserve Bank. I mean, people need to check out 1913, 1933. It's clear on the statutes. The Federal Reserve is a private bank, and they were actually recently forced into being audited, and they've issued 16.5 trillion. And that is all money that the Americans have had to pay interest on or in debt to, and that should have been created by the government, and that would have, created. America would be incredibly prosperous and a wonderful place to live in now.
It would.
And they have absolutely raped the country beyond belief, and and we're going down the same route.
Yes.
So the solution, I thought we should have a 3-stage plan, basically, in order to just move this on. We've outlined the problem very clearly, historically, and all the rest of it. First step, in my solution, drop the fractional reserve ratio from 9 to 1 down to 1 to 1.
Yes.
That's got to be the move that the government takes now. Stopping these private banks issuing currency. Well, they're not issuing currency, that's the point. They're issuing debt. You know, if the government issues the money, it is money. It is actual substance in circulation backed by substance. When the private bankers issue it out of thin air, there is no substance. They're issuing deficit. They're issuing minus something. If you can actually create nothing, they're actually creating less than nothing. They're creating debt, which is just a huge burden on the world and society, and that's just got to stop. So we drop that fractional reserve ratio down to 1, and the private banks can no longer lend money that they haven't got.
Certainly. And what's your third?
Well, second solution, as JFK, allow the government to issue the currency. And the third step that we all need to take is to have a sort of look at the fraudulent practices that have been at play for the last 300 years.
Certainly.
So I understand that mortgages, credit cards and loans, they were all created fraudulently by these banking institutions, and so actually they do not hold in lawful court.
I quite agree. And my website actually outlines this and gives a remedy to a lot of people.
So, simple solution, drop the fractional reserve ratio, government issues the currency, and then basically we wipe out all fraudulent debt, which means, you know, for our country, mortgages, credit cards and loans would be zeroed, and we'd all get a clean start. And actually, part of the government's capacity to issue currency, because we actually got less than no money in society, and we desperately need to bring actual real money of, you know, of value and substance into circulation, that could easily be done by just literally paying £20,000 into everybody's bank account. That would bring money into circulation.
Certainly.
You know, so if people's mortgages were gone, their credit cards were gone, their loans were gone, and they had 20,000 in the bank, we'd have money in the circulation, and we could just clear the national debt and get on with it. I mean,
interestingly enough, that's what the Mayans did. Every 5 years, they'd cancel out all their debts and start again. And it worked very well for them, apparently.
Every 5 years?
Every 5 years. They have one calendar.
We're slightly overdue.
We certainly are. We certainly are. One more thing I would like to add, Steve, is what Ron Paul is also suggesting is actually getting rid of the Federal Reserve Bank. In the same way, we would like to see the Bank of England not be an independent, privately run bank. What we would like to see is actually under the arm of the government. So basically get rid of its current status and actually become part of the government for the people. So it's issuing, as you say, debt-free currency and we need a limited money supply so we don't get this stupid exponential rise in money, which is bound to end up in a crash. And this is what we're seeing at the moment.
Well, when it's issued privately, as a debt and that interest, that's the mathematical consequence, and that's the point that people need to understand. When it's issued by the people, for the people, of the people, as substance, debt and interest free, that brings real money in society, and we can all flourish and prosper, and not have our sweat equity hoovered out by these private individuals.
And I'm really excited because I feel huge change is upon us, and I believe that if enough people understand what the problems are, then we can find the correct solutions. So we've got a fantastic opportunity now to take back our power, back from these private banks, back to the 99%, away from the 1%, back to the 99%. So I think it's a really exciting time to be around at the moment, because I feel that great change, we know that huge change, we've got to make some difficult decisions very soon, and we know what those decisions are.
Well, I think it's also exciting because inherent in that is reclaiming our nation for our nation once again, reinstating our national sovereignty. I think is absolutely paramount, because only once that's been reinstated can we reinstate a sovereign government, and once a sovereign government has been reinstated, then we have the power to issue our own currency and be independent from the bankers, rather than the Bank of England being independent from us, which is outrageous.
And rather than centralised decision making, let's see decision making at a local level. So, because we don't want people in Brussels making up our minds, or we don't want the IMF telling us what to do. We want democratically elected individuals at a local level to actually feed up to make decisions at national level.
Yeah. Well,
True democracy.
yeah. Well, the lessons of globalization really,
Certainly.
and centralization in the
Certainly.
hands of the few have to be learnt really, and the
Yes.
system has
Yes.
to be set up now where we truly divulge power back to the regions.
And I think if that happens, once we're not in this panic of trying to squeeze every little bit of profit out of every transaction because there's not enough money to go round, once we're not going to be under that pressure. So we're going to be able to address things like the environment, how we create power. A lot of the problems that we're seeing at the moment in the world are effectively created because of the current banking system and this idea that there isn't enough to go round. The idea that we have to intensively farm, and every time food is produced commercially, they put fillers into it which are cheap and not particularly good for you. So it's going to have huge, far-ranging consequences simply by allowing governments to create their own money on behalf of us.
Yeah. And perhaps when they're not beholden to the bankers, then they're also not beholden to their bankers' friends, like the multinational
Certainly.
corporations,
Certainly.
the arms corporations and the pharmaceutical corporations that also hoover huge amounts of money out of our society.
I quite agree.
And not always acting in the best motivated interest of the community, really.
Yeah.
Obviously going to war benefits government power, corporate monopoly and the profits of the arms industry, which is not in the interest of the people. These things obviously are all integrated into that power structure.
Certainly. And when you see people from the government moving between banks and corporations, it's like a little merry-go-round. I mean, it's frightening how they go from one minute they're a politician, next minute they're working for a bank, next minute they're working for a corporation, and some of them are already chairman or sitting on the boards of half a dozen. You wonder how they've got time to do it, don't you?
Yeah, well, it's the power elite and the way they set their structures up.
That's true.
This is what we need to start addressing now. But the very root cause of that is the big issue is who issues the currency.
Yeah.
And the answer to who it is must be found. We believe we've found it. We understand the private central banking and the private commercial banking system.
Yeah.
We understand how they create money out of thin air by fractional reserve banking. And this is what we're naming as the big issue that must be stopped,
Certainly.
really. And that is step one. Stop fractional reserve banking now, basically. Stop private banks issuing money they do not have, because the mathematical consequences of that are inevitably catastrophic for everybody on the planet, apart from those who issue, basically.
That's correct, Steve.
And we need to deal with those that issue.
Most definitely.
Take that away from the 0.1% of our planet and return that to the 99%, and then we will have real money in society, and we'll be able to run a real society.
I agree with you.
Really cares for people.
Definitely. Great. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, John.